The economic consequences of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, now well into its third year, have moved from theoretical forecast to a tangible daily reality for millions of Russians. A nation that withstood the initial shock of unprecedented Western sanctions is now grappling with a deepening internal financial crisis characterized by soaring inflation, a rapidly depreciating currency, and critical shortages of everything from imported machinery to basic food staples. The Kremlin's projection of economic stability and sovereign resilience is being severely tested as the compounded weight of international isolation, massive military expenditure, and structural weaknesses triggers what analysts describe as a slow-rolling economic emergency. The crisis is no longer confined to macroeconomic indicators. It is reflected in the anxiety of consumers facing empty shelves for certain goods, the desperation of manufacturers unable to source components, and the long-term strategic calculations of a government financing an endless war. The most visceral symptom for the average citizen is inflation, particularly for food. Annual food inflation is consistently running in the high teens, with staple items like sugar, eggs, and vegetables seeing prices double in many regions over the past year. The cost of a standard grocery basket has skyrocketed, eroding purchasing power despite repeated hikes in pensions and public sector wages. The official inflation rate acknowledged by the State Statistics Service masks even sharper localized increases, especially in remote areas far from major distribution centers. This price surge is driven by a perfect storm of factors: a severely weakened ruble making imports more expensive, logistical chaos from disrupted global supply chains, and protectionist government policies aimed at ensuring domestic supply but which often distort markets. Farmers and producers, meanwhile, face their own crisis, contending with a lack of imported seeds, breeding stock, and agricultural machinery parts formerly sourced from Europe and America, threatening future harvest and long-term food security. The story of the Russian ruble is a central drama in this financial unraveling. After an initial catastrophic collapse in early 2022, the currency staged a surprising recovery buoyed by capital controls' forced conversion of foreign currency earnings by exporters, crucially still robust revenues from oil and gas. However, this artificial stability has fractured. The ruble has lost over half its value against the US dollar since the beginning of the war, hitting multi-year lows and showing persistent volatility. The fundamental pillars of its strength have eroded. While oil revenues remain significant, they are constrained by an internationally enforced price cap and a costly, shadowy fleet of tankers needed to circumvent sanctions. The cost of imports, however, has ballooned due to the sanctions premium. The higher costs associated with sourcing goods through third countries, like Turkey, Kazakhstan, and China, and securing shipping and insurance through opaque middlemen. This has created a devastating imbalance, draining foreign currency reserves. The government and the Central Bank of Russia are engaged in a difficult balancing act with diverging priorities. The central bank, in a drastic move, hiked its key interest rate to a staggering 16% in late 2023 and has held it there. A clear emergency response aimed at curbing inflation and propping up the currency by making ruble savings more attractive. However, these high borrowing costs stifle any hope of meaningful investment in the civilian economy, crushing business loans for expansion and innovation. Conversely, the government's fiscal policy is overwhelmingly geared towards financing the war machine. Military and security spending now consumes over 6% of GDP, a Soviet-era level, and when combined with social payments to plate the population, has led to a yawning budget deficit. This deficit is being covered by drawing down the National Welfare Fund and increasing domestic borrowing, effectively cannibalizing the country's future savings for present-day conflict. The economy is thus pulled in two directions: a central bank trying to cool it down, and a government pumping it with militarized stimulus. The social consequences of this economic squeeze are profound but diffuse, unfolding in a tightly controlled society where overt protest is swiftly crushed. There is no mass starvation or breadline chaos reminiscent of the 1990s, but a gradual, grinding decline in living standards and quality of life. Real disposable incomes after a brief rise are stagnating or falling for many. The brain drain that began with the mobilization of September 2022 continues as young educated professionals seek opportunities abroad, creating a long-term human capital crisis. In regional industrial cities, the picture is darker. Many factories are reconfigured for military production, creating jobs, but at the expense of a diversified economy. Others, dependent on imported parts or foreign partnerships, have slowed or shuttered, leading to underemployment. Consumer choice has narrowed dramatically. Western brands are largely gone replaced, often by lower-quality domestic alternatives or overpriced imports from friendly nations. The psychological impact is one of lowered expectations and a retreat into subsistence and informal networks, a phenomenon sociologists term internal immigration. Historically, the Russian state and its people have endured immense economic hardship from the post-Soviet shock therapy of the 1992s to the crises of 1998 and 2008, and the earlier sanctions following the 2014 annexation of Crimea. This history has bred a certain resilience and a low threshold for economic expectations among older generations. The Kremlin's narrative heavily leverages this, framing current difficulties as yet another chapter in the nation's eternal struggle against a hostile West, thereby mobilizing a sense of patriotic endurance. However, analysts note critical differences this time. The sanctions are far more comprehensive, cutting off access to advanced technology and financial markets, not just for the state, but for entire swaths of industry. The economy is also now cut off from the very sources of modernization and growth, Western investment, technology, and expertise that helped it recover from previous downturns. The war itself is an active, all-consuming drain, unlike the frozen conflict that followed 2014. The previous model of a resource-exporting economy integrated into global markets, albeit contentiously, is irreparably broken, and no new stable model has yet emerged. Internationally, the Russian economy's performance is a key front in the wider geopolitical confrontation. Western nations, particularly the United States and the European Union, are closely monitoring the effectiveness of their sanctions regime, seeking signs of critical strain that could alter the Kremlin's strategic calculus. The gradual erosion of Russia's financial buffers and its forced pivot to a war economy is seen as a strategic success, albeit a slow-moving one. However, Russia's deepening economic ties with China, India, Iran, and other neutral or friendly states demonstrate the limitations of isolation. Trade with China has hit record levels, and the yuan has largely replaced the dollar and euro in Russia's international transactions. Yet this relationship is asymmetrical. China is a dominant buyer of Russian energy at a discount and a seller of goods ranging from cars to machine tools, but it does not provide the high-tech semiconductors or precision manufacturing equipment that Russia's defense and aerospace sectors desperately need. This has sparked a new era of creative adaptation, with reports of Russian entities engaging in complex sanctions evasion networks, using entities from Central Asia to the UAE to source restricted dual-use items. A costly and inefficient process that acts as a constant tax on the economy. The Global South, meanwhile, watches with mixed interest. Some see opportunity for cheap energy and diplomatic leverage, while others witness a cautionary tale of the cost of superpower confrontation. The enduring flow of oil revenue, despite the price cap, remains the critical lifeline, and the international community's ability to further constrict that flow is a subject of intense debate and ongoing enforcement efforts. The economic battlefield is dynamic, with each new sanctions package met with new Russian countermeasures and adaptations. The internal adaptations, while forestalling immediate collapse, are reshaping the Russian economy in profound and likely permanent ways. A state-driven military Keynesianism has become the dominant economic model. With defense and security spending exceeding 6% of GDP and accounting for over a third of the entire federal budget, resources are being forcibly redirected on a scale not seen since the Cold War. Entire factories that once produced civilian goods are now repurposed to manufacture everything from artillery shells to uniforms. While this has kept unemployment artificially low and stabilized some industrial towns, it represents a dramatic hollowing out of the nation's productive capacity for anything not related to the war effort. The government is attempting to stimulate substitute production for critical imports through massive subsidies and state orders, but the results are mixed. The loss of access to Western technology is a critical bottleneck. Producing a car without advanced microcontrollers or manufacturing precision tools without reliable foreign-made components results in inferior goods, lower productivity, and higher long-term costs. The economy is not just sanctioned. It is being systematically downgraded to a less complex, more primitive state. This reality is forging a new fragile social contract between the Kremlin and the population. In the absence of ideological fervor or widespread genuine support for the war, the state's legitimacy is increasingly underpinned by a promise of material stability. The authorities are engaging in a high-wire act, raising pensions and public sector wages to offset inflation, offering signing bonuses for military recruits, and pouring funds into subsidized mortgages and social programs in regions deemed loyal. This financial enfuge is funded by the very deficits that are fueling inflation, creating a vicious cycle. The unspoken bargain is clear: political quiescence in exchange for economic survival. Dissent is criminalized under harsh new laws, while the state media tirelessly amplifies narratives of external siege and historic mission. However, sociologists point to a growing phenomenon of atomization and apathy, a focus on personal economic survival that serves as a form of depoliticization, which the state tacitly accepts as preferable to open dissent. The risk for the Kremlin is that this bargain hinges on its ability to maintain the flow of payments. Any sudden interruption, a sharper devaluation, a failed harvest, or an inability to pay pensions or public wages on time could rupture this understanding, particularly in the less affluent regions far from Moscow and St. Petersburg. The international dimension of the crisis continues to evolve in a complex geopolitical chess game. Russia's economic pivot to the east is often overstated in its immediacy, but is undeniably a long-term strategic realignment. Trade with China has surged, but the relationship reveals new dependencies. China purchases Russian hydrocarbons at a significant discount, capturing enormous leverage as a buyer of last resort. It supplies consumer goods and basic machinery, but remains cautious in line with its own geopolitical calculus about directly supplying advanced dual-use technology that could trigger secondary sanctions. Payment systems have been reconfigured with the Chinese yuan now dominating Russia's foreign trade settlements. While this insulates Russia from immediate Western financial blockades, it also surrenders monetary sovereignty to Beijing and exposes the economy to new vulnerabilities tied to China's own financial system and political priorities. Similarly, relationships with Iran and North Korea have deepened into exchanges of military hardware for Russian technological assistance or food, relationships born of mutual isolation rather than strategic alignment. The collective West, meanwhile, faces its own challenges in maintaining a unified front. Sanctions enforcement is a constant battle against evasion networks spanning the Caucasus, Central Asia, and the Middle East. The debate continues between advocates for even stricter measures, particularly targeting the shadow fleet moving Russian oil and the financial institutions in third countries, facilitating trade, and those concerned about global economic spillovers and the political resilience of the coalition. Expert analysis converges on the view that Russia has entered a period of sustained economic stagnation with a significantly lowered growth ceiling. The pre-war model of growth driven by energy exports and consumer demand is obsolete. What has replaced it is a mobilized state capitalist system, optimized for military production and import substitution, but inherently inefficient and cut off from the streams of innovation. The human capital flight, the exodus of hundreds of thousands of young educated professionals, inflicts a demographic and intellectual wound that will impair the economy for a generation. Inflation is now structural, baked into the system by labor shortages in key sectors, logistical frictions, and the government's deficit spending. The central bank's high interest rates may temper the worst of it, but cannot eliminate the root causes. Living standards are expected to continue a gradual, decadal-long decline, reverting to levels not seen since the early 2000s for a large portion of the population. The critical unknown is the price of oil. It remains the ultimate financial buffer. A sustained period of high global oil prices, despite the cap, could replenish state coffers and prolong the current equilibrium. A sharp drop could precipitate a much faster crisis. What happens next is therefore intrinsically tied to the trajectory of the war itself. The Russian state has demonstrated a high tolerance for economic pain and a formidable capacity for political control in the short to medium term. There is no indication that the current economic distress alone will force a change in strategic direction from the Kremlin. Indeed, the war is now the central organizing principle of the entire political and economic system. The more likely scenario is a continued managed decline, where periodic currency crises and inflationary spikes are met with ad hoc controls, subsidy adjustments, and further mobilization of remaining national assets. The government will likely continue to prioritize military production and social stability payments, allowing broader civilian infrastructure and the non-military industrial base to slowly deteriorate. The world is thus witnessing not an imminent economic collapse, but the methodical transformation of a major economy into a garrison state, poorer, more isolated, less technologically advanced, and permanently on a war footing. The ultimate consequence is a Russia that poses a diminished economic threat to the global order, but a more unpredictable and militarily focused strategic challenge on its borders. Its society and economy scarred and reshaped by the choices of its leadership for years to come.